Good morning. My name is John Corellis. I feel like you all are so far away, I'm going to probably wander and walk up a little closer. I'm the Deputy State CIO for the Department of Information Technology, and my role is the Chief Data Officer for the state of North Carolina. So there's a couple terms I'm going to be throwing around. They're actually all the same thing. Chief Data Office, Data Division, and Government Data Analytics Center. It's actually all the same entity. I use them interchangeably, so just to let you know, it's kind of like gets confusing when I do start to talk, but I'm actually talking about the same thing. How many folks here are from public sector? Okay, private sector, which is what's left, okay. So, I think what I'll be speaking about is both relevant to the public sector and the private sector, because when I think about GIS and data sharing, I feel like, many times when we look and compare government to private sector is very much more innovative, usually first adopter of things. But when it comes to GIS, I think we're comparable. I think there are a lot of innovations really coming out of public sector along with the private sector community. Whoops. Okay. Sorry about this, guys. So, just to give you a little bit more about my background, I actually been in state government over 20 years, 23 years almost, and I started in 1996 as a GIS manager for the Department of Commerce. So my career's progressed into other areas beyond GIS, but really GIS is really something I'm very passionate about. But if you're here to learn about how to collect GIS data or how to use a tool, you're 15 years too late. Maybe a little bit more than 15 years too late, because my knowledge has definitely waned. I want to talk real quick just to align some of my comments and what I'm going to be speaking to. Chief Data Office, Data Division, what's our role? First off, who has a Chief Data Office in your organization? Okay, it's fairly new. It's a fairly new concept, but the whole role of a Chief Data Office is really just how do we leverage our data assets to improve services, especially in the public sector. So if you think about the things public sector performs, we try and improve health outcomes, we try and improve roads, we try and make citizens safer, allow them to, progress in education and to workforce. So what we're trying to do is really take all this data, GIS and non-GIS data, use it, leverage it, integrate it to actually improve services to citizens. Who we are, what's in my group, I have about 70 people that all they do is data. So I have an analytics solutions team, which is doing fraud, criminal justice, healthcare, all the different things, services that you actually perform in government. CGIA, so Tim Johnson this morning was presenting, so the Center for Geographic Information Analysis, that's in our group. Huge data investments, really important to the state. Something very unique, Health Information Exchange. We have the state of North Carolina has one of the largest health information exchanges in the country that we manage, clinical data, all this really good, rich information. I have a group that focuses solely on enterprise data, as well as I also have innovation within my group for the state of North Carolina. So Innovation Center, innovation activities are actually in the data group. Why? Because a lot of innovations are really around data and visualizations and things of that nature. Again, what we do is integrate data, hopefully get some value out of that data, and we collaborate with a broad community. When I talk about value, everyone's heard big data and the different V's of big data. I'm not going to talk about big data much. I'm not going to talk about AI. I'm not going to talk about machine learning. I'm not going to talk about data lakes. Private sector community can come up with all these great marketing terms, and when they deliver these solutions, government takes advantage of them. But when I do, I'm going to mention a couple things about big data. If you think about public sector and what you all manage, we've been in the big data space for a long time. And if you look at velocity, veracity, all these different V terms that describe big data, the one piece that I think we've done a good job that we're trying to improve on is getting the value out of our data. So that's the one piece when we think about big data, the area that we want to go ahead and focus more energy. So again, just briefly looking at the portfolio that we manage, that we collectively collaborate on within the state of North Carolina, one of the key components is this enterprise data management. So this is very important that, we have all these different lines of business, but are we actually doing data governance together? Are we actually doing data sharing agreements together? Are we actually documenting our data? For example, are we cataloging our data assets? Does everyone know about those data assets? Have we accomplished data sharing and ensuring privacy and security, things of that nature? This enterprise data management piece is huge. And this also takes into account things like API services, data as a service. Those are those pieces that cut across all the different focus areas or key areas of business within government. But I want to talk a little about some of these data. I'm not going to go into this, but the value is not looking at criminal justice data, looking at it for just criminal justice purposes. Plenty of value in that. The value is when you actually take criminal justice data and you actually use it to protect, integrate that with child welfare service data, and now you're actually protecting children. So the in-between white spaces on these blocks, that's where the integrations happen, and that's really where the value really happens, at least within my organization. I apologize, the clicker's not working. So in government, why do we work with data? Why do you all work with data, right? I mentioned value, but essentially we're trying to drive decisions, right? So this is one of those things that this pyramid is real important because, we talk about data, and we talk about turning data into information, turning it into knowledge, and turning it into decision making, but there's actually process components to this. And I'm going to go into more detail, but a lot of this data sharing and data integration is about change management. It's about change. It's about culture change. We're ultimately, you hear terms like evidence-based policy making, all these terms that are used by leaders around the state and beyond. What we're trying to do is take that data and just actually, by integrating it, you're turning it into more value and creating more information, more knowledge, so that you can get to better decisions. So policy makers need the best decision possible, best information possible, so they're making not gut decisions. I use an example that sometimes when I start to get frazzled in meetings where everyone wants, information, they want this knowledge. I use the example, sometimes I just say, I'm not Alexa, right? Because that's where kind of government, or at least citizens are going when we start looking at the consumerization of technology. I was speaking at a longitudinal group, and I was just using this example that, I can ask Alexa how many students graduated from NC State University between a certain period of time. Boom, it's going to give me the answers or put me in a link where I can see that information. So leaders expect that type of information at their fingertips. But you add in those that went to NC State between those years that also went to certain high schools, that also where they go up in the workforce and where are they living now, Alexa's going to choke, right? So, but the consumerization of this technology and the integration of this data is expected by leaders because it has become so easy. So, have folks experienced challenges with data sharing, right? So, I'd like to leverage your data to do X or leverage your data to do Y. Really, this is something I know I face every day. When we start talking about data sharing, people want to know, how are you going to use my data? It's really critical. It's a very fair question. So you just don't start slinging data around between partners until you understand, well, how's the data going to be used, how it's going to be managed, and how's it going to be secured, and what type of data it is. So we talk a lot about, to be able to share data, you have to know the classification of that data. Classification can mean different things to different type of technology groups. For this, it might mean HIPAA data, so it's PHI. It might be FERPA, so it's education student level data. It might be 1075, which is IRS data, or it could be just PII. All of these have to be managed differently, and they have different controls. So a lot of the issues around data sharing is being able to understand the data that you're working with and how you're going to be using that data, and then also making sure you have the right permissions, the right architectures, and things of that nature. Sometimes it's just a culture thing. I mean, we've all been there. I think we're all doing pretty well, and the GIS community does a much better job, but you start talking about someone's data, and they just start kind of like covering it up, right? Because there's a lot of things. They may not trust you. The culture may not be to share, or maybe they're embarrassed of the data, right? Or they don't have any metadata on that data. The embarrassing part is, honestly, when you start looking and start working with data, not all data is clean. Who has 100% perfectly clean data? Perfect. You're just like everyone else, by the way. I always tell folks there's good data and bad data and good data. It just needs to be documented. So when you start thinking about a lot of the government data assets that we have, a lot of it was administrative data. And now we're trying to use it to do something else. So again, you're not alone if your data is not perfect, but let that not be the reason you're not going to share information to help someone else. Of all the slides I present, this is really it in a nutshell. Ignore the right-hand side. My organization has a lot of legislative authority. That's not what we're here to present. What we're here to present is, everyone wants to get to this data-driven government, and what does that mean? The analytics, the visualizations, you all know this as well as I do, if not better. That's the easy part, right? The hard part is building this foundation for data integration and data sharing. So it's like a house. I always look at the house. You have to build from the foundation up. Those key components for data sharing and data integration are in the block, not at the very top. Leaders want to know answers, but what you want to do is focus on those foundational elements. For example, data stewardship. Leadership. In government, I always say that we don't own data. I hope for the public folks in the room that you don't consider your data your property. It's not, it's citizen data. We're the custodians of that, right? So the citizens are entrusting with us their data to actually do good things with it, I hope. So when you think about government, we're not collecting data, for any other purpose, or we shouldn't be, than to improve services. Okay, or to make roads safe, or for making proper decisions. So this leadership, stewardship, culture, this all really has to be in place to be able to get to that data sharing and common understanding of how data is going to be utilized. The data standards, again, going back to the quality. Thinking about, do we have an understanding of how the data can be used, and the quality of that data? Is it cataloged, right? Is your data cataloged? Do you have a catalog that you can go to and see the data, how it's collected, when it's collected, things of that nature? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But when we get into this thing called data governance at the top, if you don't know your data, what data are you governing? So I always talk to folks. I was on a call earlier this week where folks are saying, we need data governance, we need data governance. This is one group with a specific focus. And I'm like, okay, what data are we going to govern? Like, we don't know yet. We should do an assessment. I'm like, that's probably a good idea. So when you start thinking about data governance, you really need to know the data you're going to be governing. But data governance is extremely important to the data sharing aspect. So this really is about doing agreements. This is about having conversations and the use of data and the value and things of that nature. Hierarchy. What's the best source for this data? So you might have 4 different sources for a different type of data. GIS is very well known for this. We have so many different layers. You have duplication of layers. What's the best source and why? I'm not trying to be a little bit snarky here, but I work with criminal justice data. I work with all these different data assets at the state. And whenever I have confusion about what may be the best address for an individual, I actually, if they're in the sex offender registry, that's the best address because it's actually verified more frequently than the other data. So understanding kind of what's the best address or what's the best point, what's the best anything is really important. And that's really getting into that hierarchy. And then the security piece is huge. So, when I think of GIS and where GIS has gone, it's been overwhelming the actual grassroots efforts from the 90s with GIS in the early 2000s to the really formalization of this being really an industry that is, I think, a leader for data sharing and whatnot. But I think there's so many more opportunities to leverage geospatial data deeper into other analytic efforts. And when you're starting to talk about that, you're talking about data security. So if you think about if you want to derive some type of clinical analytics or something, that's PHI data. If you look at all these different data that you might want to integrate with, you have to understand the security aspects to be able to build trust with the partner or the custodian of that data. This is, I think, when I say one of the things that my group does, I'm actually speaking really on behalf of the state. When we are successful, what do we really do and how do we actually get to that sharing to get to some type of analytic or visualization or some type of knowledge? We really spend most of our time understanding the challenge or opportunity. So this is kind of that what's happening, why is it happening? That kind of inquisitive thing. I always like to tell my team that the challenge and opportunity is really where you have to be intellectually curious, because you have to understand the business of the folks that you're working with trying to solve their problems. You have to understand at least some of it and have to understand how to partner. The whole data management piece really comes into, you can't jump into a project full steam ahead until you understand, is the data even available? What's the data like? How do we actually start leveraging the data? How do we even access that data? How does that data even come to me? Where does it reside? That's really what we call the EDA component, which is that exploratory data analysis as well, to see someone said the data is this, is it really that? Partner and share. Any of the analytic efforts, and this is, I think you guys know this, it's not just analytics, any type of technology efforts, you really have to partner and share. This is sharing knowledge, it's sharing technology, sharing other types of information. It's not just about data, it's sharing people's brains and what's in it. Then you finally get to the analytics. But I think we all know that when you start talking to leadership and you make it an assignment, it usually starts with, I need a visualization X. And then all the hard work is trying to figure out how you actually can put those pieces together for that final visualization. The visualization is going to take no time at all. There's plenty of tools out there, but it's actually about being able to work your way through this process. And I will speed it up. This is just a slide that I want to present, which I'm always scared to present this slide only because I have a Gartner license. There's all these different graphs out there, maturity in analytics, maturity in data. I don't like them because I don't think they're real world and they change every single year. So how does it change so drastic from last year to this year? It's like a whole new core set of things that what adds up to being a mature organization from a data perspective. So this is our derived kind of maturity around data sharing, analytics. So my team had developed this, which is what we call crawl, walk, run, and soar. This is really, I think, critical in how you can measure where you are or where you want to be. So when you think about reactive in the data world, that's that what is happening, right? So something's happened. So you're really thinking about what's happening, reporting facts and figures, spreadsheets, access data, siloed data, operational reports. So this is basically your information you're producing. The tactical, which I would say walking, which is why is it happening? So this has happened, but why? So you can take a case like opioid, right? What is happening? People are dying. Why is it happening? Is it overprescribing? What is the reason why? So it's getting a little deeper. You're integrating additional data sources across just beyond just your agency. You start to integrate other data and start to share that data. and you start to get into that evidence-based policy. You're reaching beyond yourself. The strategic is really when you get into what will happen, right? So that's that real analytic, that forecast. What will happen if this keeps going, or how do we actually change that, right? And you start looking at predictive models, and you start thinking about enterprise data. And you also don't think about just bringing all the data in-house. You're thinking about more of a federated model. And then dynamic, what is happening right now? So you think about dynamic is, I do a lot of work in healthcare. I actually, a patient is in front of me. What do I need to know about that patient? And then in real time, how does their maybe primary care provider need to know what's going on with that patient that might be sitting in an emergency room? Other real time is sensors, things of that nature, but we're talking about integrating that information with other information. So that's really getting to that real time. And I use healthcare safety as another good example. And I think hurricanes would be a good example in disaster recovery. So really quickly, looking ahead, when I talk to my organization, some people are here from the organization. One of the things I keep challenging the folks is deeper integration with our analytics, deeper integration of GIS with other information. The other is in government, when we start moving data around all over the place, we're actually creating risk, potentially exposing data. So the concept of data as a service or API as a service is something we're driving towards, and we're actually building capabilities around that. We actually will have a service up and running within the next month or so. So that we can actually be doing more of that data as a service. Data asset catalog, this is really just cataloging your data. Where does it reside? What's the lineage? What happens to that data? So actually automate some of that data information of where the data is. Entity resolution, how does your data connect? Right, so this is about having those connections into your data. So for a citizen, they might be receiving 20 different services from 10 different agencies. So how are they actually connected, and how can you look at those services across all those agencies? Entity resolution, think about it, the best address too. Those type of things. Data governance is critical. We all talk about it. We all do it at various levels, but kind of more enterprise data governance is always helpful. So proactively talking about how you can share information and proactively developing agreements on how information can be shared. I'm actually working on one with all the education institutions. We're developing an MOA that would basically define data sharing between, I think it's 8 different parties, one agreement. And then mastering the data. So this is not master data management from a tool. This is mastering the data from kind of understanding the data. So when you think about master data management, and your mind wants to go to a $20 million tool. This is about mastering the data for criminal justice, mastering the data for health, mastering the data for different purposes, and then trying to pull it together at some point in time. And I think I'm over, like normal.
Lunch is after.
Perfect. Questions?
We've got time for questions.
Wow. That confused everyone? Good. Yes.
I guess I'll bring a little.
Okay.
So can you explain one of your challenges in trying to sell the importance of GIS to one of the departments, or what the challenges and how you overcame that?
Sure. I actually think Tim Johnson's sitting right there, and he works in our group. I think it's everything that I think the GIS community has done successfully from an enterprise perspective has been identifying the business case and the need. So you look at things like the orthoimagery effort. That didn't start with here's a bunch of money. That started with here's the use that there's so many different uses that use cases that we may have. What's the value? Now how do we fund it? So it always starts with that business and use case. So that would be a great example. I think when you start looking at a lot of the presentations around the hurricane, I think that's going to change how we probably invest in data as well. So you always have some type of problem or issue. I can look at my criminal justice. My criminal justice portfolio, my division's criminal justice portfolio is huge. It started with 2 murders and trying to help figure out how those may have been prevented, or if we had additional information, how you could have maybe provided enough information for those that actually had seen those individuals that then committed murder. And it grows into what else can you do? So it always starts with some type of problem statement, business objective, and then it grows usually into something far beyond whatever we had identified.
How often cases you integrate your GIS with analytics involving solutions or problems, identify problems?
So I think some of the more recent use cases where we're trying to look at integrating with GIS with analytics, it's really integrating GIS with other data to then perform analytics. So it would be, I have a healthcare, in our division, we have a healthcare organization that's the Health Information Exchange for the state of North Carolina. And we are trying to actually map the providers so that we could then look and see where there's maybe gaps in services, whether it's Medicaid or other things. So really just integrating that. We're actually not doing enough of the analytics with the GIS, but we do a lot of fraud. And so when we start looking at fraud, we start to see patterns. A lot of those patterns may surface through geography. And I'm not actually allowed to go into some of the details, but when you start looking at the network analysis and associations, there's usually a geography component to it. So that's where Tim Johnson and myself are really trying to put a lot of energy and effort is to integrating that GIS into our analytic efforts. They shouldn't be separate. Yes?
Do you run into any issues of data custodians that do consider themselves data owners that are less willing to share their data, even just within your own organization?
So within the state enterprise, absolutely. It's someone, the typical would be someone like that's been in government a long time, that they've actually been managing data that's typically maybe not the best quality, and that's where they're kind of hovering over it. So what we try and do is, we don't want to be punitive. We want to kind of make sure that they understand the value of that. And if we actually integrate that data, what they could actually get out of it. And then when that doesn't work, we actually have legislation that says you must do. We try not to lead with the you must do. The you must do is like, walking into an agency, beating your chest. That's not going to be helpful. It's really about explaining how we can collaborate, how we're going to protect the data, and what they can get out of it as well. But yes, that's pretty critical.
Any other questions? So, number 27.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.